Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, the 6'6" warrior who fought on 3 continents, the man who commanded Byzantine emperor's elite guard, the king who died in 1066 trying to conquer England. September 25th, 1066, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the day the Viking Age ended forever. This is not just another Viking story. This is the final chapter. This is the end of an era. This is the true story of Harald Hardrada, the last of his kind. The man whose death marked the end of 300 years of Viking dominance. From exiled prince to Varangian commander. From Constantinople's golden halls to Norway's frozen throne. From legendary wealth to a battlefield in England. This is how the Viking Age ended. This is the legend of Harald Hardrada, the hard ruler, the last great Viking king. They called him Hardrada, which means hard ruler in Old Norse. Not as a compliment, but as a warning. This is the story of the last great Viking king, a warrior who fought on 3 continents, served Byzantine emperors, amassed legendary wealth, and ultimately died trying to claim the throne of England in what would become the final act of the Viking Age. This is the saga of Harald Hardrada, the 6.5-foot giant whose death at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 marked the end of an era. This is the legend of the man who was born a prince, became an exile, rose to become the commander of the Varangian Guard, returned home to claim a kingdom, and died reaching for an empire. The year was 1015 AD when Harald Sigurdsson was born in Norway, the half-brother of King Olaf II Haraldsson, known to history as Saint Olaf. Harald entered a world where the Viking Age was already in its twilight years, where the wild raiding days of Ragnar and Bjorn were fading into legend, replaced by the more complex realities of established kingdoms, Christian conversion, and political intrigue. Norway was in constant turmoil, with various claimants fighting for the throne, with Christianity and the Old Norse religion in conflict, with powerful jarls challenging royal authority. Into this chaos, Harald was born, and chaos would define his entire life. His early childhood was spent in the court of his half-brother Olaf, who was attempting to consolidate power over Norway and force Christian conversion on a population that was largely still pagan. Olaf was a controversial figure, using extreme methods to impose Christianity, destroying pagan temples, executing those who refused baptism, creating enemies throughout the land. Young Harald absorbed these lessons about power, about how force could achieve what diplomacy could not, about the costs of rulership. These early experiences would shape his approach to leadership for the rest of his life. When Harald was just 15 years old, everything changed. King Canute of Denmark and England, one of the most powerful rulers in Northern Europe, decided to assert his claim over Norway. He gathered a massive army and fleet, supported by Norwegian nobles who had grown to hate Olaf's brutal methods of Christian conversion. The forces met at the Battle of Stiklestad in July 1030, a conflict that would determine Norway's future and young Harald's fate. Harald fought in this battle despite his youth, commanding a section of his brother's army. He fought bravely, desperately, knowing that defeat meant exile or death. But Olaf's forces were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The battle became a massacre, and Olaf himself was killed, struck down by his own Norwegian subjects who had allied with Canute. Harald was severely wounded, a sword slash across his neck that should have killed him but somehow didn't. He was carried from the battlefield by loyal retainers, barely alive, a 15-year-old prince who had just lost his kingdom, his brother, and nearly his life. What followed was a desperate flight across Norway, with Canute's forces hunting for survivors of Olaf's army. Harald and a small group of loyal men fled east, through forests and over mountains, barely staying ahead of their pursuers. They eventually reached Sweden, where the Swedish king, related to Harald through complex family connections, gave them temporary sanctuary. But Sweden was not safe long-term. Canute's influence extended there as well, and Harald knew he couldn't stay. So began one of the most remarkable journeys in medieval history, Harold, still recovering from his wounds, still just a teenager, decided to travel to Kiev in the Rus territories, what is now Ukraine and Russia. The journey was incredibly dangerous, covering over 1,000 miles through hostile and wild territory, through forests filled with bandits, across rivers that could sweep away unwary travelers, through lands where a Norwegian prince had no authority and no protection beyond what his sword could provide. He arrived in Kiev around 1031, at the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, one of the most powerful rulers in Eastern Europe. Yaroslav welcomed Harold, seeing potential in this young Norwegian prince. Harold entered Yaroslav's service, commanding warriors in campaigns against various enemies, learning the arts of war and politics from one of the era's master practitioners. For several years, Harold fought for Yaroslav, gaining experience, building a reputation, accumulating some wealth. But Harold's ambitions extended far beyond serving another man's kingdom, no matter how powerful. Around 1034, when Harold was about 19, he made a decision that would transform his life. He traveled south to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the greatest city in the Christian world, a metropolis of hundreds of thousands of people that made Scandinavian settlements look like villages. Constantinople was wealth and power and sophistication beyond anything Harold had experienced. And the Byzantine emperors maintained an elite guard unit called the Varangian Guard, composed primarily of Scandinavian warriors, Vikings who had traveled thousands of miles to serve the Byzantine throne in exchange for wealth and glory. Harold joined the Varangian Guard and quickly distinguished himself. He was tall, even by Viking standards, standing well over 6 feet when the average man was perhaps 5'6". He was strong, skilled with weapons, brave to the point of recklessness, and possessed a natural charisma that made men willing to follow him into desperate situations. Within a few years, he had risen to command the entire Varangian Guard, an unprecedented achievement for someone so young, a position of immense prestige and power. For the next decade, from roughly 1035 to 1042, Harold served the Byzantine Empire with distinction and accumulated legendary wealth that would become the foundation of his future power. The Byzantine Empire was the richest and most sophisticated state in the medieval world, heir to the Eastern Roman Empire, controlling vast territories and commanding resources that dwarfed anything in Western Europe. Constantinople itself was a city of wonders, with 500,000 inhabitants, massive stone buildings, aqueducts, libraries, and wealth displayed openly in ways that shocked visiting Vikings accustomed to wooden halls and simpler lifestyles. The Varangian Guard, which Harold now commanded, was an elite unit of approximately 6,000 warriors, serving as the emperor's personal bodyguard and as shock troops in major military campaigns. The position was incredibly prestigious and lucrative. Varangians received regular salaries in gold, bonuses for successful campaigns, and traditional rights to loot imperial treasuries when emperors died, a practice called palace plundering that could make a warrior wealthy in a single night. Harold took full advantage of every opportunity to accumulate wealth, sending massive amounts of gold back to Kiev for safekeeping. Harold participated in campaigns throughout the Mediterranean and into the Middle East, fighting in conflicts that ranged from full-scale wars to anti-piracy operations. He led Varangian forces in Sicily against Arab raiders who had been threatening Byzantine possessions, conducting amphibious operations that combined Viking naval expertise with Byzantine organizational capabilities. These campaigns were brutal and profitable, with captured cities yielding enormous amounts of treasure that was divided among the victorious troops. In southern Italy, Harold commanded Byzantine forces against the Lombards and other local powers who threatened imperial interests in the region. He became known for innovative siege tactics, combining traditional Viking aggression with Byzantine engineering knowledge. He learned to use siege engines, to coordinate complex military operations involving multiple army units and naval squadrons, to think strategically about campaigns that lasted months or years rather than the quick raids Vikings traditionally favored. The Byzantine Chronicles, written by educated court officials who generally looked down on barbarian warriors like the Vikings, nonetheless recorded Harold's achievements with grudging respect. They described him as exceptionally tall, intimidating in appearance, brave to the point of recklessness, and possessed of a cunning that made him dangerous in both battle and politics. They also noted his ruthlessness, his willingness to employ deception and terror tactics, his lack of mercy toward defeated enemies. Harold developed a reputation for what we might today consider war crimes, but what medieval warriors often viewed as acceptable or even clever tactics. When Byzantine forces captured enemy cities that had resisted strongly, Harold would maximize terror to discourage future resistance. The story of using birds to set a town ablaze, while possibly exaggerated, reflects the kind of psychological warfare he employed. He understood that making examples of cities that resisted could make future conquests easier, as terrified populations would surrender rather than face similar treatment. The wealth Harold accumulated during these Byzantine years was truly staggering, far exceeding what any Viking raider could hope to gather through traditional raids on England or Francia. Byzantine service paid in gold, not silver, and paid regularly and generously. A successful commander like Harold could accumulate in a few years what would take decades of raiding to gather. He was systematic about this wealth accumulation, living relatively simply himself while saving and investing his earnings, building up the fortune that would later allow him to buy an army and challenge for a kingdom. His departure from Constantinople was dramatic and surrounded by legend. According to the sagas, Harold had fallen in love with a Byzantine princess and asked to marry her, but was refused because of his lower status despite his military achievements. Other sources suggest he became entangled in Byzantine political intrigue, supporting the wrong faction in an imperial succession dispute. Whatever the exact circumstances, Harold left Constantinople suddenly and under circumstances that might have been voluntary, or might have been barely avoiding imprisonment or worse. He returned to Kiev, collected his accumulated wealth, and married Elisiv, the daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, cementing his alliance with one of Eastern Europe's most powerful rulers. With this marriage, this wealth, and his military reputation, Harold was ready to reclaim his birthright in Norway. He was now 27 years old, a veteran of countless battles across 3 continents, wealthy beyond measure, politically connected, and burning with ambition to rule the kingdom he had been forced to flee as a wounded teenager. Norway in 1045 was ruled by Magnus the Good, the son of Saint Olaf, and therefore Harold's nephew. Magnus had driven out the Danish overlords and reclaimed Norway, and he had also become king of Denmark. Harold arrived with ships and warriors bought with his Byzantine gold, prepared to take the throne by force if necessary. But Magnus, recognizing that a civil war would benefit only their enemies, agreed to share power with his uncle. Norway would have 2 kings, ruling jointly, an unusual arrangement, but one that prevented immediate bloodshed. This joint rule lasted until 1047, when Magnus died unexpectedly, possibly from disease, leaving Harold as sole king of Norway. Harold's years in Byzantine service had taught him sophisticated methods of statecraft, and he set about consolidating his power with ruthless efficiency. He eliminated potential rivals, brought rebellious jarls to heel, established a strong central authority that had been lacking in Norway for generations. His nickname, Hardrada, dates from this period, reflecting his uncompromising approach to rule. For nearly 20 years, from 1047 to 1066, Harold ruled Norway with an iron hand, while constantly looking for opportunities to expand his power and influence beyond Scandinavia's borders. His years abroad had fundamentally changed him, exposing him to sophisticated Byzantine administration and grand strategic thinking that most Scandinavian rulers never experienced. He brought these lessons home, transforming Norway's government in ways that would outlast him. Harold established a more centralized royal authority than Norway had ever known, reducing the power of regional jarls who had traditionally operated with significant independence. He built royal strongholds throughout the kingdom, positioning loyal garrisons in strategic locations, creating a network of power that allowed him to respond quickly to threats or rebellions. He reformed the tax system, making it more regular and predictable, using Byzantine administrative models to create a more efficient revenue collection system that funded his military ambitions. He fought a long, grinding war with Denmark that lasted intermittently throughout his reign, seeking to add that wealthy kingdom to his holdings and reunite the throne that Magnus the Good had briefly held. This conflict was inconclusive militarily, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. But it kept Harold's warriors sharp and battle-ready, maintained Norway's military readiness, and demonstrated to potential challengers that Harold was not a king to be trifled with. Harold dealt harshly with internal dissent, showing none of the mercy or political flexibility that had sometimes been his brother Olaf's approach. When Jarls challenged his authority, he crushed them militarily and confiscated their lands. When regions resisted his tax collectors, he led punitive expeditions that left no doubt about the consequences of defying royal authority. His nickname Hardrada, the Hard Ruler, dates from this period, reflecting his uncompromising and often brutal approach to governance. But Harold was not merely a tyrant. He also understood the importance of legitimacy and popular support. He maintained the traditional thing, assemblies where free men could air grievances and participate in justice, though he ensured these assemblies reached conclusions he approved of. He patronized churches and monasteries, supporting the Christian establishment that provided much of his regime's ideological justification. He composed poetry, a highly valued skill in Norse culture, demonstrating that he was not just a warrior, but also a cultured man worthy of respect. He built up Norway's military capabilities systematically, maintaining a large royal fleet that could be mobilized quickly for offensive or defensive operations. He kept his personal retinue of warriors, the Herd, at strength and well-equipped, ensuring he always had a core of professional fighters loyal directly to him rather than to regional jarls. He established weapon production facilities and shipyards, creating military infrastructure that enhanced Norway's power projection capabilities. Throughout these 2 decades of rule, Harold was clearly preparing for something larger, though what exactly that was wouldn't become fully clear until the opportunity presented itself in 1066. He accumulated resources, built military strength, established secure control over his kingdom, and waited for the right moment to pursue the grand ambition that had driven him since his exile as a teenager. The desire to be remembered as one of history's great conquerors, to achieve something that would echo through the ages. In England, King Edward the Confessor died in January 1066 without a clear heir, triggering a succession crisis that would reshape European history. Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, claimed the throne and was crowned king almost immediately. But there were other claimants. Duke William of Normandy claimed Edward had promised him the succession, and Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, also claimed rights to the English throne based on a complex agreement between Magnus the Good and an earlier English king. Harold saw his opportunity. England was wealthy, powerful, prestigious. Taking the English throne would cement his legacy as one of history's great conquerors. He began assembling a massive invasion force, the largest Norwegian fleet in generations, calling in every favor, spending his accumulated wealth, rallying warriors with promises of English riches. He allied with Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of the new English king, who provided intelligence about English defenses and promised support from discontented English nobles. In September 1066, Harold's fleet sailed for England, hundreds of ships carrying thousands of warriors. They landed in northern England and quickly captured York, defeating local forces at the Battle of Fulford. The initial invasion was stunningly successful. It seemed Harold's long experience, his tactical brilliance, his overwhelming force would carry the day. England appeared to be his for the taking. But Harold Godwinson, the English king, responded with unexpected speed and decisiveness. He force-marched his army north, covering nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, an incredible feat of organization and endurance. Harald Hardrada had no idea the English king was coming. His forces were dispersed. Many warriors had left their armor on the ships because the weather was warm. They were resting after their recent victory. They were unprepared for battle. On September 25th, 1066, at Stamford Bridge, just outside York, the English army appeared on the horizon. completely unexpected by the Norwegian forces. The Vikings were scattered, unprepared, catastrophically vulnerable. Many warriors had left their heavy mail armor on the ships several miles away because the late September weather was unseasonably warm. They were resting after their recent victory at Fulford, dividing plunder, celebrating their apparent success. Some sources suggest Harold had even been in negotiations with local English nobles about terms of submission. So confident was he that the conquest was essentially complete. The Norwegian army scrambled desperately to form defensive positions, trying to buy time for scattered forces to assemble from their various positions around York, for warriors to somehow retrieve their armor from the distant ships, for reinforcements to arrive. They formed a shield wall on the eastern side of the River Derwent, using the bridge as a natural choke point that would force the English army to attack on a narrow front where Norwegian fighting skills could offset English numerical advantages. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later Norse sagas, a single Norwegian warrior made a legendary stand on the bridge itself, holding the entire English army at bay single-handedly for a significant period. Armed with a massive two-handed axe, he fought with berserker fury, killing or wounding dozens of English soldiers, refusing to yield even as the bodies piled up around him. The English couldn't get past him, couldn't bring their numbers to bear in the confined space of the bridge. Finally, according to legend, an enterprising English soldier floated underneath the bridge in a half-barrel or small boat and thrust a spear upward through the gaps in the wooden planking, mortally wounding the Norwegian champion from below. With the bridge finally cleared, the English army surged across, engaging the main Norwegian force in brutal close-quarters combat. Harald Hardrada fought at the very front of his formation, as Viking kings were culturally expected to do, leading by personal example, inspiring his men through visible courage. Despite being 50 years old, he was still a formidable warrior, his height and reach giving him advantages in individual combat, his decades of experience making him deadly efficient with his weapons. The battle raged for hours, the outcome uncertain despite English advantages in numbers and preparation. The Vikings, even without their armor, fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant death since they were far from their ships and any hope of escape. Harold personally led several counterattacks, trying to break the English lines, trying to create an opportunity for his forces to disengage and retreat to their ships where they could regroup with their armor and reinforcements. It was during one of these desperate counterattacks that Harold's fate was sealed. An English arrow, shot from the massed ranks of English archers that Harold Godwinson had positioned to support his main battle line, struck Harold in the throat. The wound was almost certainly immediately fatal, the arrow piercing major blood vessels and possibly the windpipe. Accounts differ on the exact details, some saying he died instantly, others that he lived long enough to speak final words to his men, encouraging them to continue fighting, to make the English pay for every foot of ground. Harold's death did not immediately end the battle. The Vikings, leaderless but unwilling to surrender, continued fighting with suicidal bravery. Some sources say that Eystein Ore, who had been with the ships and arrived late to the battle with the reinforcements and the armor that might have changed the outcome, led a final desperate charge that briefly pushed the English back before being overwhelmed. The battle continued into the late afternoon, becoming less a military engagement than a massacre as exhausted, unarmored Vikings were systematically cut down by English forces. Of the 300 ships that had come to England, only 24 returned to Norway, carrying the shattered remnants of Harold's army and his body for burial. 3 weeks later, on October 14th, 1066, Duke William of Normandy defeated Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, killed the English king, and conquered England. The date 1066 became one of the most famous in English history, but it was actually 2 invasions, 2 battles, 2 dramatic conclusions. Harald Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge is often considered the true end of the Viking Age, the final act of the era that had begun with the raid on Lindisfarne nearly 300 years earlier. Harald Hardrada's legacy is complex and multifaceted. He was undeniably a great warrior. His military achievements across 3 continents were genuine and impressive. His rise from exiled teenage prince to commander of the Varangian Guard to King of Norway was remarkable. His accumulation of wealth and his ability to inspire loyalty were extraordinary. But his ultimate failure in England, his death in a battle he should never have fought while unprepared, raises questions about his judgment and his ability to adapt his tactics to changing circumstances. Modern historians see Harold as a transitional figure, embodying both the old Viking values of personal courage and martial prowess and the newer medieval values of sophisticated statecraft and political maneuvering. His service in Byzantium exposed him to levels of civilization and political complexity that most Scandinavians never encountered. His rule in Norway showed he had learned those lessons, but his invasion of England showed he was still, at heart, a Viking warrior seeking glory through conquest. His death marked a symbolic ending. After Stamford Bridge and Hastings, the era of Viking invasions was truly over. The Scandinavian kingdoms would continue, would develop into proper medieval states, would participate in European politics and warfare. But the age of longships appearing on the horizon to raid and conquer, the age of warriors like Ragnar and Bjorn and Harold seeking fame and fortune through maritime adventure, that age was finished. Harald Hardrada was its last great champion, and his death was its epitaph. From the exiled boy fleeing across Norway with a sword wound in his neck to the mighty king lying dead on an English battlefield, Harald Hardrada lived a life that spanned the world and defined an era. He fought in Scandinavia, Russia, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and England. He served princes and emperors, commanded elite troops, accumulated legendary wealth, ruled a kingdom for 2 decades, and died reaching for another crown. He was the last of his kind, the final act of a dramatic age, the end of the Viking story. If you enjoyed this epic saga of the last great Viking king, make sure to subscribe to Viking Valhalla for more untold stories of the greatest warriors history has ever known. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another legendary tale. We've covered Ragnar the legend, Ivar the genius, Lagertha the shield maiden, Bjorn the explorer, and now Harold the last king. The Viking saga is complete. Until next time, may your courage be legendary and your legacy eternal. Skål.